I am Daniel Hayes, and in 2024 I lived in Silver Pines, Washington, a place where I thought I had everything figured out. My life looked like one of those perfect photographs you frame and hang above the fireplace, the kind that makes people nod and say, "Now that's a man who's got it all." I had a wife named Laura, a career as a freelance photographer, and a cozy little house tucked away in a town that smelled of pine and rain. Silver Pines was the kind of spot you'd see on a postcard, with its misty forests, red maple leaves falling like slow-motion confetti, and wooden homes glowing softly against the grey sky. The rain never stopped here, a constant drizzle that soaked into your bones, but it made the place feel alive, like it was whispering secrets if you listened close enough. Back then, I believed I was the husband every woman dreamed of. I spent my days chasing light through my camera lens, capturing the way the fog clung to the trees or the way the river reflected the mountains on a rare, clear morning. Laura would tell me my photos were good, sometimes great, and I'd feel that little spark of pride. We'd been married 8 years, and I thought we were a team. She was the beauty who turned heads, the woman who could sell a crumbling shack and make you think it was a mansion. I was the quiet artist, the guy who made her life look even better in pictures. Together, we were the couple Silver Pines admired, or so I told myself. But here's the thing about photographs. They only show what you want them to. You can crop out the shadows, adjust the focus, and hide the flaws until the image looks flawless. That's what my marriage was, a carefully framed shot that hid the cracks creeping up the edges. I didn't see them at first, and not until Laura decided to rip the whole picture apart right in front of me. It happened at a dinner party, one I'd spent hours setting up, thinking it'd make her proud. She had this smile, the kind that promised trouble, and when she turned it on me that night, I didn't know it'd be the beginning of the end. She called me a tiny man, not just in height, but in every way that cuts a guy deep, and she did it with a room full of her colleagues, laughing along. I can still hear their chuckles, the way the air turned thick with pity and embarrassment while I stood there, holding a tray of appetizers like some fool who didn't get the punchline. Laura raised her glass and toasted to her little husband, and I forced a smile, thinking maybe it was just wine talking. But it wasn't. That night cracked something open inside me, and what spilled out wasn't just hurt, it was truth. She'd been mocking me for years, chipping away at who I was, and I'd been too busy adjusting the lens to notice. Worse, I found out she'd been stepping out with someone else, someone she called a real man, in texts she didn't think I'd ever see. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this now, months after the dust settled. Maybe it's because I still feel that sting, the way her words burned hotter than any fire in our old wood stove. Or maybe it's because what happened next was too good not to share. See, Laura didn't just break my heart that night, she broke the illusion I'd lived in for 8 years. And when I finally walked away, when I dragged her into court, and watched her cry like she'd never cried before, it was the sweetest revenge I could have asked for. Her tears weren't just water, they were proof I wasn't the tiny man she'd painted me to be. Silver Pines might look like a quiet little nowhere, but it's where my story turned upside down. This isn't some sob story about a guy who lost everything, though. It's about what happens when you stop letting someone else hold the camera, when you take the shot yourself and decide what's worth keeping in the frame. Laura thought she could keep me small forever, a blurry figure in the background of her perfect life. She was wrong. I'm here to tell you how it all went down, from the night she humiliated me in front of her fancy friends to the day I stood tall in a courtroom watching her fall apart. Stick with me, because this isn't just about a marriage gone sour. It's about the lies we swallow, the ones we tell ourselves to keep going, and the moment we spit them out and walk away. Laura mocked me with that wicked grin, thinking I'd never fight back. She didn't count on me finding those messages, didn't think I'd have the guts to leave, and she sure didn't expect the fight that came after. By the time we're done, you'll see why her tears in that courtroom were my masterpiece, a picture worth more than 1,000 words. This is my story, from the sting of her laughter to the sound of her sobbing, and trust me, it's one you won't forget. I used to think Laura and I were the kind of couple people envied in Silver Pines, Washington. Picture it, me, Daniel Hayes, the guy with a camera slung around his neck, snapping shots of the misty forest like some artsy dreamer, and Laura, the queen of real estate, selling houses faster than I could frame them. We lived in a wooden house on Elm Street, the kind with a porch that creaked under the weight of too many rainy days. From the outside, it was perfect, all warm lights and cozy vibes. The kind of place you'd want to raise a family if we'd ever gotten around to that. But step inside and you'd see the truth. Our marriage was a photograph I'd spent 8 years trying to keep in focus, while Laura was busy smudging the lens. I'm a freelance photographer, always have been. I loved the way the world looked through my camera, the way I could capture a moment and make it mine. Silver Pines was my canvas, with its endless pines stretching up to touch the clouds and the rain that turned every puddle into a mirror. I'd spend hours out there chasing the perfect light, coming home with shots of deer in the fog or the river cutting through the valley. Laura would flip through them sometimes, nodding like she cared, saying things like, "Pretty good, Dan," or "You've got an eye for this." I'd beam, thinking she meant it, thinking it mattered to her that I was good at something. Turns out she was just humouring me, the way you pat a kid on the head for a stick figure drawing. Laura, though, she was the real deal in her world. She managed real estate like it was a game she'd already won, closing deals on cabins and cottages with a smile that could sell ice to a snowman. She'd stride into a room, all confidence and charm, her heels clicking like she owned the place, and people ate it up. Silver Pines adored her, called her the woman who could turn a fixer-upper into a gold mine. She'd come home with stories of clients signing contracts over coffee, her eyes lighting up in a way they never did for my photos. I'd listen, proud as hell, thinking we balanced each other out, her with the big wins, me with the quiet art. We looked good together, that's for sure. She'd drag me to town events, me in my best jacket, her in some dress that hugged her like it was custom-made. People would smile and say we were the perfect pair, the artist and the deal-maker, like we'd stepped out of some small-town fairy tale. Laura loved that, loved posting about it online too. She'd snap a picture of us by the fireplace, me holding my camera, her with a glass of wine, and caption it, "Living the dream with my favourite guy." The likes would roll in, hearts and comments about how lucky we were. I'd grin at my phone, thinking she meant it, not realising she was building a stage for her own show, one where I was just a prop. But here's where the frame starts to crack. Laura had this habit of cutting me down, little jabs she'd toss out like they were nothing. It started small back when we were dating. She'd laugh and say I should stand on a box for our wedding photos since I'm barely 5'7", and she's got those long legs that make her tower over me in heels. I'd chuckle, thinking it was cute, just her way of teasing. Then it got sharper. At home, she'd watch me edit photos and mutter, "Those shots are as quick to fade as you are," with a smirk I didn't know how to read. I'd brush it off, tell myself she was tired from work, that she didn't mean it. It wasn't just the height thing either. She'd poke at my work too. I'd show her a photo I was proud of, maybe a sunset over the falls, and she'd tilt her head and say, "Nice, but it's not exactly gallery material, is it?" I'd laugh, thinking she was keeping me humble, but it stung. Then came the bedroom comments, the ones that hit below the belt. She'd roll her eyes after we'd been together, sighing, "Is that it already? I'm used to it by now." I'd try harder, adjust the settings, so to speak, but she'd just shake her head like I was a lens she couldn't get to focus. I told myself every couple has their quirks, that she was just blunt, not cruel. Silver Pines didn't see that side of her, of course. To them, she was Laura Hayes, the real estate star who could talk you into buying a house with a leaky roof and call it character. She'd host open houses, flashing that $1,000,000 smile, while I'd tag along with my camera, snapping shots for her listings. Clients loved it, loved us, said we were a team. I'd stand there, adjusting my tripod, feeling like I was part of something big. But at home, she'd look at those same photos and say, "They're fine, Dan, but don't quit your day job, okay?" I'd nod, thinking she was joking, not catching the way her eyes flicked away, like I was a blurry spot she didn't want to see. The truth is, I was blind to it all for years, 8 years to be exact. I'd built this idea of us in my head, a picture-perfect marriage where I was the steady guy and she was the spark. I didn't notice how she'd build me up just enough to keep me hanging on, only to knock me down when it suited her. She'd tell me I looked sharp before we went out, then later tell her friends I dressed like a kid who'd raided his dad's closet. She'd praise a shot I took in private, then laugh it off in public, saying I'd never make it big. I'd smile through it, thinking that's what love looked like, not realizing it was a slow drip of poison I'd been drinking. Looking back, I see the signs, Everywhere, the way she'd linger on her phone, typing away with a secret little grin, saying it was just work stuff, the way she'd come home late from showings, her lipstick a shade off, her excuses too smooth. I didn't question it, didn't want to mess up the composition of our life. Silver Pines saw us as the golden couple, and I wanted to believe it too. Laura had me convinced I was lucky to have her, that her jabs were just part of the package. Like rain in this town, you can't escape. But pictures don't lie forever. You can tweak them all you want, crop out the ugly bits, but eventually the raw image shows through. That dinner party was coming, the one where she'd take her private digs and put them on a stage for everyone to see. I didn't know it yet, but it'd be the night that flipped the switch, the one that made me stop posing for her perfect little portrait. Laura thought she had me figured out, a small man she could keep in her frame forever. She didn't see the storm brewing, didn't think I'd ever step out of the shot. I was about to prove her wrong, and trust me, it'd be a hell of a picture when I did. I'll never forget that night in June 2024, the one that turned my life into a snapshot I'd rather burn than frame. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. Laura had been on me for weeks about hosting a dinner party at our place in Silver Pines, Washington. She said it was for her real estate crew, a chance to network with colleagues and their spouses, to show off her perfect little life. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of playing the good husband, the one who'd make her shine in front of her fancy friends. So I said yes, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. If I'd known what was coming, I'd have bolted the door and tossed the key into the rainy woods. Our house on Elm Street was small but warm, the kind of place that smelled like cedar and old memories. I spent the whole day getting it ready. I swept the floors until they gleamed, dusted the shelves where my camera gear sat, and set up the dining room like it was a stage. I wanted it to look good, not just for Laura, but for me too. I'm a photographer after all, and I've got an eye for details. I hung a few of my best shots on the walls, black and white prints of the Silver Pines forest, thinking maybe someone would notice, maybe even say something nice. Then I turned to the food. I'm no chef, but I can manage. I planned a 3-course meal, a salad with walnuts and goat cheese, a roast chicken with rosemary from the backyard, and a chocolate tart I'd practiced twice to get right. I chilled the wine, set the table with our best plates, and even lit a couple of candles. By 6 o'clock the place looked like a postcard, and I felt pretty damn proud. The guests started trickling in around 7, a dozen of them, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a real estate ad. There was Laura's boss, a guy with a handshake like a vice, and a few of her co-workers with their spouses, all smiles and small talk. I greeted them at the door, camera slung around my neck, because I figured I'd snap some candids for Laura's next listing pitch. They seemed to like the setup, complimenting the salad as I passed it around, sipping the wine and nodding at the chicken like it wasn't half bad. I started to relax, thinking maybe this wouldn't be a disaster. Maybe Laura would see how hard I'd worked. Maybe she'd even thank me later. I was wrong. Laura was on her 3rd glass of wine by the time the plates were cleared for dessert. She'd been chatty all night, laughing louder than usual, her cheeks flushed from the booze. I didn't think much of it. She liked to play the life of the party. But then the conversation shifted to relationships. Some throwaway comment from her boss's wife about how lucky she was to have a handy husband. Laura turned to me, and I saw that smile. The one I'd learned to dread over 8 years. It wasn't warm or loving. It was sharp, like a lens catching the wrong light. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the chatter, a little too loud, a little too bright. "You know what's funny?" she said, locking eyes with me before swinging her gaze to the table. "When I first met Daniel, I thought he'd be this amazing catch. Tall, successful, impressive in all areas." She paused, letting the word all hang there, then winked like she was in on some grand joke. The table chuckled, thinking it was harmless spouse banter. Her boss's husband grinned and said, "And he isn't." I felt my stomach twist, but I kept my smile plastered on, waiting for the punchline. Laura didn't miss a beat. "Well, let's just say," she said, holding up her hand, pinching her thumb and index finger so close they almost touched, "some things don't measure up to expectations." The room erupted in laughter, a wave of it crashing over me. My face burned and I couldn't look at anyone, just stared at the tart crumbs on my plate. She wasn't done. "Honestly, it's like being married to a teenage boy," she went on, her voice slurring just enough to make it sting more. "Quick to start, quicker to finish, if you know what I mean." More laughs, louder this time, bouncing off the walls I'd scrubbed clean. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table. One of her co-workers, a woman with kind eyes, tried to steer things away, asking about the tart recipe, but Laura waved her off. "No, really, it's fine," she said, her tone dripping with fake pity. "We all have our crosses to bear. Mine's just smaller than most." She raised her glass in a mock toast, and the table joined her, some reluctantly and some with gusto. The air turned thick, heavy with awkward tension, and I could feel their eyes on me, pity and embarrassment mixing like smoke. I didn't touch my dessert, didn't say a word, just kept my head down as the chatter moved on to safer ground, but the damage was done. What hurt most wasn't the laughter or the way they avoided looking at me after. It was knowing Laura, the woman I'd poured my life into, thought so little of me, she'd turned my deepest insecurities into a party trick. I'd spent hours making that night perfect, thinking it'd mean something to her, thinking it'd show her I was worth a damn. Instead, she'd taken my effort, my pride, my manhood, and dangled it in front of her friends like a cheap prop. I cleared the plates on autopilot, refilled their glasses with a smile I didn't feel, all while something inside me cracked wide open. I could see it in their faces, that uncomfortable awareness you can't shake, the kind that says they'd never look at me the same. When the last guest left, I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes in silence. Laura breezed in, tossing her wineglass in the sink like nothing had happened. "Good night, huh?" she said, humming to herself. I couldn't hold it in. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice low, shaking. She turned, eyebrows up like I'd surprised her. "What was what?" she said, then laughed. "Oh, lighten up, Daniel. It was just a joke. Everyone does it. Playful jabs at their partners. You're too sensitive." She shrugged, like it was nothing. Like she hadn't just gutted me in front of a dozen people. I stared at her, this woman I'd loved for 8 years, and felt like I was seeing a stranger. "Too sensitive," I said, but she was already halfway out the room, muttering about how tired she was. That night she slept like a baby, her breathing steady beside me, while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her words played on repeat: tiny man, teenage boy, booster seat. It wasn't the first time she'd cut me down, but it was the first time she'd done it so loud, so public, like she wanted the whole world to know I wasn't enough. I kept thinking about those laughs, the way they echoed in my head, and something shifted. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the crack that had been growing for years, the one I'd been too blind to see. Laura thought she'd gotten away with it, that I'd swallow it like I always did. She didn't know I was already replaying every jab she'd ever thrown, every time she'd made me feel small. That dinner party wasn't some fluke. It was the flash that lit up the dark corners of our marriage. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. I just lay there, listening to the rain tap the roof, feeling the weight of 8 years pressing down. Little did I know it was the start of something bigger, the moment I'd stop posing for her picture and start shooting my own. Laura had no idea what she'd set in motion, but I'd make sure she'd feel it soon enough. That dinner party in June 2024 didn't just leave me humiliated, it flipped a switch I didn't know I had. I'm Daniel Hayes, the freelance photographer from Silver Pines, Washington, and up until that night I'd been living in a fog thicker than the mist rolling off the pines. Laura's words, tiny man, teenage boy, quick to finish, kept bouncing around my skull like a bad echo, but it wasn't just the sting of her public roast that kept me up. It was the way she'd breezed through the aftermath, acting like she hadn't just torched 8 years of my life with a wink and a wineglass. I lay awake after she'd drifted off, staring at the shadows on our bedroom ceiling, replaying every jab she'd ever thrown. Something was wrong, deeper than her usual cruelty, and I couldn't shake it. The next day I went through the motions, editing photos in my little studio at the back of our Elm Street house. The rain tapped the window like it was trying to tell me something, but I wasn't listening yet. Laura was out, probably showing some overpriced cabin to a client, and I was alone with my thoughts. That's when Mike Turner called. Mike's my best friend, the guy who runs the coffee shop downtown Pine Brew. He's a big bear of a man, always got a mug in his hand and a story to tell. We'd known each other since high school, back when I was the skinny kid with a cheap camera, and he was the jock who didn't laugh at me for it. He had been at the dinner party, one of the few who didn't join the chorus of chuckles, and I could tell he'd felt bad for me. "Hey, Dan," he said when I picked up, his voice gruff over the line. "You okay after last night? That was rough." I tried to play it cool, told him I was fine, just a little embarrassed, but Mike wasn't buying it. "Listen, man," he said, lowering his tone like he was about to spill a secret. "I've been hearing stuff at the shop. People talk, you know. Laura's name's come up a few times, and it's not about houses. Something about her and that contractor, Mark Evans. You might want to check it out." I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. Mark was a house builder, a guy Laura worked with on projects, all swagger and toolbox charm. I'd met him once, thought he was just another client. "Check what out?" I asked, my throat tight. Mike sighed. "Her phone, Dan. Just look. I don't trust her after that stunt she pulled." I didn't want to believe it. Trust was the one thing I'd clung to, even when Laura made me feel like a speck on her lens. But Mike's words stuck, and the more I thought about it, the more I saw the signs I'd ignored. Laura was glued to her phone lately, always flipping it face down when I walked in, stepping out to take calls at odd hours, saying it was work stuff. Work at 10 p.m. on a Saturday? I'd bought it every time, too busy adjusting my own focus to question hers. 2 days after the party, I got my chance. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, something she rarely did. It buzzed once, then twice, then 3 times, insistent little chirps that felt like a dare. I'd never snooped before, always told myself I was above that, but after that night my instincts screamed louder than my pride. I picked it up, hands trembling like I was holding a live wire. The lock screen showed previews from someone saved as Contractor Mark. The first message said, "Missing you already." The second, "Last night was incredible." The third, "When can you get away again?" My stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. Laura hadn't changed her password since we'd set up our phones years ago, some dumb anniversary date I'd never forget. I typed it in, and the screen opened like a Pandora's box I couldn't unsee. Hundreds of messages stretched back months, a timeline of betrayal I'd been too blind to notice. There were photos, too. Blurry shots of hotel rooms, her in a dress I didn't recognize, him grinning like he'd won the lottery. My knees buckled and I leaned against the counter, scrolling through the wreckage of my marriage. The texts were brutal. They'd planned meetups, laughed about how I'd never catch on. One thread was from the night of the dinner party. Laura had written, "He just sits there and takes it. I called him tiny and inadequate in front of everyone, and he still served dessert with a smile. It's almost too easy." Mark replied, "That's because he knows he can't do better than you." My chest tightened, the air sucked out of the room. Another message hit harder. Mark asked, "Feel guilty at all?" Laura shot back, "Being with a real man for once. He should thank me for staying this long." I read it twice, then 3 times, letting the words carve into me. 7 months. That's how long this had been going on, right under my nose. While I was out shooting fog and trees like an idiot, I kept digging, couldn't stop myself. Hotel receipts popped up in our joint email, places I'd never been, dates we'd supposedly spent together. Credit card statements showed dinners at restaurants I didn't know, weekend trips she'd called, work conferences her company never held. The evidence piled up like a stack of bad negatives, each one darker than the last. Mark wasn't some random fling. He was her equal at work, a contractor she'd met on a project whose wife had been sitting across from me at that damn dinner table, oblivious as I was. I printed it all, screenshots, emails, statements, my hands shaking so bad I nearly jammed the printer. I stuffed everything into a folder, locked it in my desk, and waited for Laura to finish her shower. That night I played normal. She came out, hair wet, humming like nothing was wrong, and I asked about her day. "Busy," she said, scrolling her phone with that secret grin I now recognized. "Good news at work?" I asked, casual as I could manage. "Just a project coming together," she replied, not looking up. "Nothing you'd understand?" I nodded, sipped my coffee, and studied her. This was the woman I'd loved, the one I'd framed in my mind as my partner, my muse. Now she was a stranger, a liar who'd turned me into a punchline while she played house with someone else. "I love you," I said, testing the words. "Love you too," she mumbled, automatic, her eyes glued to her screen. That was it, the moment it crystallized. This wasn't love, it was a sham, and I was done pretending. I called Mike the next morning, told him everything. "Jesus, Dan," he said, his voice heavy. "I knew she was cold, but this, you've got enough to bury her." He was right. I had proof, not just of the affair, but of the years she'd chipped away at me, making me feel small so she could feel big. I met him at Pine Brew, and over a black coffee he helped me plan. "Get a lawyer," he said. "Move your money. She's not going to take this line down." I listened, nodding, feeling a resolve I hadn't known I had. That afternoon I opened a new account, transferred half our joint funds, and called a divorce lawyer Mike recommended. a guy named Tom who'd handled his cousin's split. I told him what I had, what I wanted, and he said, "You've got a solid case, Daniel, let's make it quick." By evening, I was ready. I'd moved my camera gear and clothes to Mike's spare room while Laura was out showing a house. I left the folder locked in my desk, knowing I'd need it soon. When she got home, I cooked dinner like nothing was wrong, salmon and roasted potatoes, her favourite. She walked in, surprised, tossing her keys on the counter. "What's this for?" she asked, smiling like she still owned me. "Just felt like it," I said, pouring her wine. We ate in silence, her texting away, me watching her like I was framing my last shot of her. I didn't confront her yet. I wanted everything in place first. But inside, I was done. Laura thought she'd humiliated me into submission, that I'd stay her little prop forever. She didn't know I'd seen the raw footage of her life, and I was about to expose it all. The next move was mine, and it'd be a picture she'd never forget. By September 2024, I'd had enough of playing the fool in Silver Pines, Washington. I'm Daniel Hayes, the freelance photographer who'd spent 8 years letting Laura frame me as her little sidekick. And that dinner party back in June had been the flash that burned away the last of my illusions. Finding those texts from Mark, her contractor lover, had turned my hurt into something sharper, a resolve I hadn't known I could muster. I'd seen the truth in black and white, printed it out and locked it away, but I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I wanted everything lined up, every shot in focus before I pulled the trigger. Laura thought she'd keep me in her blurry background forever. She was about to learn I'd been sharpening my lens all along. The plan came together fast after I'd spilled it all to Mike over coffee at Pine Brew. He'd been my rock, the guy who'd seen through Laura's act long before I did. With his help, I'd moved half our joint account to a new one, stashed my camera gear at his place, and hired Tom, the lawyer he swore by. Tom was a no-nonsense type, grey hair and a voice like gravel, and when I showed him the folder, texts, photos, hotel receipts, he didn't blink. "You've got her dead to rights, Daniel," he said. "Adultery, emotional distress. We can push for the house and your studio. She won't see it coming." I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. I didn't want revenge, not really. I just wanted out, and I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. I picked a night to do it, September 15th, a rainy Tuesday that matched the storm brewing inside me. Laura was out late again, probably with Mark, spinning her usual client meeting excuse. I used the time to set the stage. I'd been sleeping at Mike's for a week, sneaking back during the day to pack essentials, but tonight was different. I wanted her to walk into something she couldn't ignore. I cooked her favourite, salmon with roasted potatoes, the kind of meal I'd made 100 times to see her smile. I set the table in our Elm Street house, lit a candle, and placed the folder of evidence right where her plate should have been. It wasn't about the food. It was about the moment she'd realised the picture had changed. She got home around 8, her heels clicking on the porch like nothing was wrong. I heard her fumble with her keys, then step inside, the rain dripping off her coat. "Daniel?" she called, her voice bright with surprise. "What's this?" She walked into the dining room, saw the setup, and grinned like she'd won something. "Oh, you cooked? What's the occasion?" She tossed her keys on the counter, still clueless, and sat down across from me. I didn't say a word, just poured her a glass of wine and slid the folder toward her. She frowned, picking it up. "What's this?" she asked, flipping it open. Then her face changed, shock washing over it like a bad exposure. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the silence. She stared at the pages, the texts from Mark, the hotel bills, her own words mocking me in print. Her mouth opened, then closed like a fish, gasping for air. "This isn't what it looks like," she started, her tone shaky. "He's just a client, Daniel. You're overreacting," I almost laughed. 7 months of texts isn't a client," I said. "Pictures of you in his hotel room aren't business. Calling me tiny while you're with him, that's not work." She blinked, scrambling for a foothold. "You went through my phone?" she snapped, trying to flip it back on me. "That's an invasion of privacy." "Yeah," I said, calm as the rain outside. "After 8 years of your public stunts and private lies, I finally listened to my gut. You've got no ground to stand on here, Laura." Her strategy shifted fast. She slammed the folder shut, her eyes narrowing. "You're nothing without me," she spat. "You think you're some big man now? Mark's twice what you'll ever be. Financially, physically, everything." "I was bored, Daniel, stuck with you." I nodded, letting her words sink in, feeling them bounce off me like water on a lens. "That's why I'm leaving," I said. "I deserve better than someone who thinks I'm a joke." She froze, her face twisting as the reality hit. I stood, grabbed my coat and the suitcase I'd packed, and headed for the door. That's when she cracked. "Wait!" she said, jumping up, her voice breaking. "Don't go, Daniel! I messed up, okay? I was wrong. I'm sorry." She grabbed my arm, tears spilling down her cheeks. Real ones this time, not the fake ones she'd tried at the table. I looked at her, this woman I'd loved, and felt nothing but pity. "You're sorry now?" I said, pulling free. "After 8 years of tearing me down, 7 months of him, and 1 night of turning me into a laughingstock. Too late, Laura." I stepped out into the rain, her sobs echoing behind me as I walked to Mike's truck parked down the block. "Damn," Mike said as I climbed in, soaked but steady. "She didn't take that well." I smirked, wiping water off my face. "She's not used to losing the shot." We drove off, her cries fading into the drizzle, and I felt lighter than I had in years. That was just the beginning, though. Laura didn't let it end with a slammed door. The next day, Tom filed the divorce papers, claiming adultery and emotional distress, asking for the house and my studio. I figured she'd sign and slink away. Ashamed of her own mess, I was wrong again. She fought back, hard. By October, she'd hired a lawyer, some slick guy from out of town named Richard, who tried to paint me as the bad guy. They countered my claim, saying I'd abandoned her, that the affair was a momentary lapse under work stress. She wanted the house, half my savings, even a cut of my photography income, claiming she'd supported my career by letting me live there. I almost laughed when Tom read me that part. "Supported me?" I said. "She mocked every photo I took." Tom just nodded, flipping through his notes. "She's grasping, Daniel. We've got the evidence. She's not winning this." The war dragged on through the fall, turning Silver Pines into a battleground of whispers. People at Mike's coffee shop started picking sides, some saying Laura got what she deserved, others muttering I should have stayed quiet like a good husband. She played the victim well, showing up at open houses with red eyes, telling clients I'd walked out over nothing. I kept my head down, shooting photos of the changing leaves, letting Tom handle the legal mess. But it wasn't easy. She'd call me late at night, leaving voicemails that swung from begging to raging. "Come back, Daniel. We can fix this," one said. The next, "You'll regret this, you little nobody." I saved them all, handed them to Tom, watched him grin. "She's digging her own grave," he said. By March 2025, we were set for court. Laura didn't let up, showing up at my studio one rainy afternoon, banging on the door. "You can't do this to me!" she shouted, mascara streaking her face. I didn't open it, just watched through the window as she stormed off. Mike was there, bringing me coffee, and he shook his head. "She's losing it, man," he said. "Well, you're the one holding steady." I nodded, sipping the brew, feeling the weight of what was coming. The divorce wasn't just about leaving her, it was about taking back the life she'd stolen piece by piece. Laura thought she'd humiliated me into staying, that I'd never fight back. She didn't count on me having proof, didn't think I'd have the spine to walk out, and she sure didn't expect the courtroom showdown brewing. I'd moved my gear, my money, my heart out of her reach, and now I was ready to face her one last time. The rain kept falling in Silver Pines, washing away the old picture of us, and I was about to step into a new frame. Laura's tears that night were just the preview. The real show was coming, and I'd make sure it was a shot she'd never forget. By March 2025, the divorce war with Laura had turned Silver Pines, Washington, into a stage I never wanted to shoot. I'm Daniel Hayes, the freelance photographer who'd spent 8 years letting her crop me out of my own life, but now I was done being her blurry backdrop. That night in September when I walked out, leaving her sobbing on the porch, was just the opening frame. She'd fought back with everything she had, dragging us into a courtroom showdown that had been brewing for months. I'd moved on, or at least I was trying to, living in a small apartment above Mike's coffee shop, Pine Brew, snapping photos of the rain-soaked pines to keep my mind steady. But Laura wasn't letting go without a fight, and I was ready to finish this once and for all. The trial hit on March 10th, a grey Monday that matched the mood in the Silver Pines courthouse. It was a small place, wood-panelled and quiet, the kind of room where secrets didn't stay buried long. I sat with Tom, my lawyer, in a suit I'd ironed twice, clutching my folder of evidence like it was a lifeline. Laura was across the aisle, dressed sharp as ever, her real estate polish still intact despite the mess she'd made. Her lawyer, Richard, was a slick city type, all gelled hair and pointed questions, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She'd been playing the victim for months, crying to anyone who'd listen about how I'd abandoned her, but I knew the truth was in those texts, those receipts, and I was about to let it loose. The judge, a stern woman named Carter, started things off, and Tom went first. He laid it out clean. 8 years of emotional abuse, capped by Laura's public humiliation at that dinner party, followed by 7 months of adultery with Mark Evans, her contractor fling. He showed the messages, the ones where she'd called me tiny, and laughed about it with Mark, projected them on a screen for the whole room to see. I kept my head up, even as my ears burned, hearing her words read aloud again. "He just sits there and takes it," Tom quoted, his voice steady. "She mocked him in front of her colleagues, then carried on an affair under his nose. We're asking for the house and his photography studio, Your Honor." Laura's turn came, and Richard spun a different story. He said I'd overreacted to a harmless joke, that the affair was a brief mistake born from work stress, that I'd walked out and left her in financial ruin. She took the stand, tears welling up right on cue, her voice soft and shaky. "I messed up," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "I was under so much pressure selling houses, and Daniel was always gone with his camera. I didn't mean to hurt him. I just want the house. Something to start over." It was a good act, I'll give her that. Half the room looked ready to hand her a tissue and the keys, but then came the twist I'd been holding on to, the one Mike had helped me catch. Tom called him to the stand, and my best friend lumbered up, coffee stains on his shirt like a badge. "Mike Turner," he said, swearing in. "I run Pine Brew, and I've known Daniel since we were kids." Tom handed him a stack of photos I'd taken, ones I'd kept quiet about until now. "Tell us about these," Tom said. Mike nodded, holding up the first shot. "This is from that dinner party last June. Daniel was taking candids, like always. Look here." He pointed to a corner of the frame where Laura stood by the window, texting with a smirk while I served dessert. "I saw her step out later. Thought it was odd." He flipped to the next photo, time-stamped that same night. "This one's from my shop's security cam across the street," he said. "Caught Laura and Mark Evans meeting up outside 10 minutes after the guests left. They didn't see Daniel's lens." The room went still, Laura's face paling as the judge leaned forward. "And this," Mike said, showing a third shot, "is from a week later at one of Mark's construction sites. Daniel followed her, got this of them together. She wasn't selling houses that day. The photos hit like a sledgehammer, proof she'd been with Mark right under my nose, even as she mocked me at that table. Laura's lawyer jumped up, objecting, saying the photos were circumstantial, but Judge Carter waved him off. "I'll allow it," she said, her eyes narrowing at Laura. Richard tried to recover, grilling Mike about timing, but my friend didn't budge. "I know what I saw," he said. "She played Daniel for a fool, and those pictures don't lie." Laura squirmed, her tears drying up fast, and I felt a flicker of something close to triumph. Tom closed it out, pointing to the screen. "She didn't just cheat, Your Honor, she humiliated him, then lied about it for months. Those photos show the truth." The judge took it all in, and by April 1st the ruling came down. I won. The house went to me, along with my studio and most of our savings. Laura got her car and a chunk of cash, but her real estate career took a hit when the scandal spread. Clients dropped her, whispers about her and Mark turning into shouts at Mike's shop. She lost her job by mid-April, the bank citing reputational damage after her boss saw the courtroom fallout. I didn't gloat, didn't need to. Watching her cry on that stand, her perfect mask slipping as Mike's photos tore it off, was enough. I sold the house on Elm Street a month later, didn't want the memories clinging to it like damp rot. With the money, I opened a proper studio downtown, a little place with big windows and a sign that read Hayes Photography. I started shooting again, really shooting, not just for survival, but for me. The pines, the river, the way the rain caught the light, it all came back into focus. I even picked up my guitar again, something Laura had mocked me out of years ago, and played at Mike's open mic nights. The crowd clapped, and I grinned, feeling like I'd stepped out of her shadow for good. Then there was Emily Parker. She was a local artist, all paint-stained hands and quiet smiles, who'd started coming to Pine Brew to sketch. We met over coffee one day, her laughing at my bad latte art, me admiring her landscapes. She didn't care about my height or my past, just like my photos and the way I saw the world. Our first date was a hike through the woods, me snapping shots while she painted, and when we got close, she didn't sigh or turn away. "That was perfect," she said after, her arms around me, and I believed her. Laura's voice faded a little more that day. The real kicker came in late April at my first studio exhibit. I'd hung shots from the past year, including a few from that dinner party, cropped to show just the table's edge, a quiet nod to where it all changed. People milled around, sipping wine, praising my work, and then I saw her. Laura stood by the door, thinner than I remembered, her sharp edges dulled by months of fallout. She walked over, eyes red, voice low. "Daniel," she said, "I didn't know what I had until I lost it. I'm sorry for everything." I looked at her, this woman who'd once held my world, and felt nothing but distance. "Thanks," I said, simple and flat. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She nodded, tears spilling, and turned to go. Emily came up beside me, slipping her hand in mine. "Who was that?" she asked. "Old client," I said, and we went back to the crowd. Laura lingered by the exit, watching me laugh with Emily, her face a mess of regret and something else I didn't care to name. I didn't need her sorry anymore. I had my life, my art, my shot at happiness. That courtroom moment, her tears under the judge's glare, was my masterpiece. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because it proved I wasn't the tiny man she'd framed me as. I'd walked out of her picture and into my own, and every click of my shutter since was a victory she'd never touch. Laura's breakdown wasn't the end, it was the start of me, living loud, clear and free in Silver Pines. And that, folks, was worth more than any house or apology she could ever offer.